Welcome back to our web series on passive fire protection. In this episode 2, we're going to be looking at the hierarchy of legislation, aka the building code or the National Construction Code. For this web series, we're going to be looking at NCC 2022. So let's dive into it. The NCC, or the National Construction Code, is a national approach to construction that's been put together by the ABCB, and you can actually find free copies of it online on the ABCB website. There is no longer any need to have a login or credentials, so you can just jump straight in and find the relevant clauses that apply to you. When it looks at passive fire protection, Section C is where we're going to be spending most of our time. Now in NCC 2022, they did update a lot of the code references. So where we're looking at, for example, service penetrations in C4D15, you might be familiar with the clause C3.15 in the previous version of the NCC. Not a lot has changed in the content, but it is worth being aware that the actual names of the clauses have all changed a little bit. So before we have a look at the exact clauses, let's do a quick refresh on how the NCC actually works. The building code is a performance-based document, and that means that it gives us a list of performance requirements, which you can think of as the overarching objective of the building. And then we need to prove that we can meet that level of performance. So it tells us how high to jump. We need to prove that we can jump that high. And to do that, it gives us two options. There is a performance-based approach, which means when it comes to fire protection, a fire engineer can write a performance solution to address the specific performance requirements of the specific building. And that means on a site-specific basis, you can engage a fire engineer to look at the design of the building and design for fire appropriately. Alternatively, there is also what we call a deemed to satisfy pathway, or DTS as we'll refer to. And the deemed to satisfy pathway basically gives us a list of steps that we can follow. Prescribed steps which call up certain Australian standards, which we can go and do product testing, system testing to develop the performance and prove that we can meet that level of performance stated in the code. And that should, in theory, provide us with a compliant and safe building. So in today's series, we're really just going to be looking at the deemed to satisfy pathways. So all of the options we'll look at are following deemed to satisfy. On this slide, we'll have a quick overview of the building code and which parts of the code I think are important for passive fire protection. So starting with Section A, it gives us the governing requirements, and it's really useful because it tells us how to read and comply with the NCC. There's a lot of legal definitions and terms, so this is a good starting point to have a look at definitions and just make sure you understand what it means when it says words like required and shall. Section C is obviously where we're going to spend most of our time, fire resistance. C1 sets out the goals of the fire design. So these are some of the performance requirements. You'll find in here, it'll list things like you can't allow spread of fire between buildings. You can't allow structural collapse due to fire. You can't allow fire spread through fire compartments, that sort of thing. So they're very higher level performance requirements. C2 is fire resistance and stability. So here's where the building code tells you what type and class of building you've got. You know, is it a school? Is it a hospital? Is it a high-rise residential? And then it'll give you the type of building, types A, B, or C. It also tells us what materials we're allowed to make our buildings out of. So this is where things like non-combustibility and fire spread properties come into it. C3 is compartmentation and separation. So this part of the code tells us that we need to split our buildings into certain sizes and areas of fire zones based on the type and class. It also gives us what level of fire resistance that each of those need. So for example, if you've got an apartment, the level of FRL will be different to say if you've got a hospital where it's going to take a lot longer for the residents to evacuate. So you can find all that information in C3. C4 is what we're really focused on today, which is protection of openings. So C4D10 talks about service penetrations in fire isolated exits. And I've got a little note there that says avoid doing this. The fire exits are meant to be the safest path of egress from a building. And the building code tries to limit the amount of holes you can put in the fire escape for obvious reasons. There are some services that are allowed, so fire hydrants, lighting, anything that's going to help the fire escape during a fire is permitted. Otherwise, avoid putting anything else in there. C4D11, openings and shafts. If you've got a building with a fire rated access hatch or a garbage chute, there are some important clauses in here relating to the fire resistance level that you should be aware of. C4D15 is openings for services. These are the nuts and bolts of service penetrations, and we're going to dig into this one in particular. C4D16 is construction joints, or control joints, expansion joints. Outside of section C, there are some other clauses and standards worth knowing. So Schedule 2 is the reference document. This is where the building code calls up the different types of Australian standards and which ones you're allowed to use. This is really important because in previous versions of the code, you could use older versions of, say, AS 1530 Part 4, the fire testing standard. But in this version of the NCC, it only allows for the 2014 version. So we can't use old testing anymore. It has to be done to the most current standard. So Schedule 2 is a great one to know about because you can check all the standards that you're working to and make sure that they're the right versions. And lastly, Specification 1 is something that's often overlooked but really important when it comes to talking about FRLs. Now we'll define FRL in the next episode, but be aware that even though you do a fire test and you have an FRL, you should also cross-reference it with Specification 1 because that's the lens that your certifiers and your building surveyors are going to be checking your paperwork to make sure they comply with this part of the code to be suitable evidence of compliance if you're following that deemed to satisfy pathway.